Good evening and good morning to everyone in both countries, made possible by the miracle of Zoom. It's just a technology that's working well for us right now, despite the circumstances that caused it. Today's special webinar is on Indonesia's foreign policy positioning between China and the United States, enduring themes, recent issues, and outlook in the post-U.S. election environment. That last part of the title was written before the election, but still, it's all right. This program is brought to you jointly by USINDO and the Stimson Center's new Southeast Asian Forum, headed by Professor Bill Wise, who's with us now. I would like to thank and note the presence of Indonesia's new ambassador to the United States, Mohammed Lutfi, Indonesia's two co-chairs, Pak Teo Sambuaga and Ambassador Bob Blake, USINDO's co-chair emeritus, Ambassador Stapleton Roy, former U.S. ambassador both to China and Indonesia. Welcome, Stape, if you're on the line. Our many trustees, advisors, members, and colleague organizations present, and all of our 250-person Zoom audience today in both countries. A few ground rules. This program is on the record. The two main speakers have agreed to that, and we thank them for that. However, there will be and should be no recordings made, with the exception of one recording USINDO is making for its own use in case we need to be sure who said what. I'd like now to invite USINDO's partner, the Southeast Asia Forum at the Stimson Center, and Professor Bill Wise for introductory remarks. Bill?
Good morning, everyone on the U.S. East Coast, and good evening to our friends in Indonesia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. It's a great pleasure for me to join David in welcoming you to this most interesting discussion. The Southeast Asia Forum that I chair is a new project, as David mentioned, at the Stimson Center in Washington. Our mission is to promote, facilitate, and expand the study of Southeast Asia at colleges, universities, and research institutions. But our scope is really broader. We also look to encourage government officials, NGO leaders, and private sector to focus on Southeast Asia and especially U.S. relations with the region and its states. This is our first event in conjunction with USINDO since we formalized our partnership with USINDO last month. As a longtime member of USINDO and a new member of the USINDO Board of Advisors, I'm especially pleased that the Southeast Asia Forum at Stimson Center is co-sponsoring this meeting. David, we're looking forward to the discussion, so please set the scene for us and introduce our distinguished speakers. After we hear from our speakers, we'll turn to your questions. You may submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. David?
Thank you, Bill. I'll make a brief opening statement, and then our two speakers will make their presentations, followed by the Q&A. The Q&A is going to be moderated by Professor Wise. Today's program is Indonesia's foreign policy positioning between China and the United States, enduring themes, recent issues, and outlook in the post-U.S. election environment. Indonesia is committed to navigate its foundational, quote, free and active, unquote, and independent foreign policy through the increasing geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. However, even within Indonesia's maintaining its core foreign policy, the U.S. and China have both made recent strong overtures to Indonesia. Actually, if you go back in history, this has happened before, but it's happening again. On the U.S. side, over the past few months, the Trump administration has notably increased its diplomatic, economic, and security outreach to maritime Southeast Asia, and much of the attention has gone to Indonesia. Indonesian Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto was received in Washington in October for discussions, including enhanced defense cooperation, military procurement, training, exercises, and maritime security in the region, security cooperation in the region, and other topics. The heads of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, a new U.S. entity patterned after a previous one, and the U.S. Exim Bank visited Indonesia simultaneously a few weeks ago on the subject of expanding U.S. investment and trade. This is a very hot button issue. Secretary of State Pompeo visited Jakarta a few weeks ago and promoted U.S. investment, especially in the digital, energy, and infrastructure sectors. Both countries welcome cooperation to maintain the South China Sea as a stable and peaceful sea under international law, and the pursuit of this objective in both ASEAN and the UN. Both countries also believed it was important to safeguard maritime sovereignty and security around the Fortuna Islands. Interestingly, and I saw this in the press release, Indonesia encouraged that, quote, U.S. investment projects include the outer islands of Indonesia, such as Natuna. We can try to figure that out. I won't go over all the Chinese overtures, but they've principally been in the business area as well as security. There's a Chinese joint venture to build the Jakarta to Bandung high-speed rail link. There's a Chinese company building 5 hydro power dams in Kalimantan, another to build a dam in Sumatra, another in mining and mineral processing in Sulawesi. And on the maritime security side, Chinese Coast Guard vessels regularly intrude deep into Indonesia's exclusive economic zone in the North Natuna Islands resource-rich area, sometimes prompting Jakarta to send fighter jets or ships to nudge the Chinese vessels to leave. Some analysts suspect, we can debate about if it's valid. It's trying to expand its 9-dash sovereignty claim in the South China Sea to include the Natunas. What does this amplified and high level of Chinese activity portend for regional stability, security, and prosperity? How is China responding to the U.S. initiatives? How is Indonesia, the largest member of ASEAN, balancing its relations with the major powers and dealing with its neighbors on these issues? How do the speakers see the U.S. elections affecting the role of the U.S. in Asia and with China and Indonesia? Our 2 distinguished speakers today are Murray Hiebert of CSIS, author of the recent book, Under Beijing's Shadow, Southeast Asia, China Challenge, released in August, and Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar of the Center for Political Studies at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences and Vice Chair of the Board of Management at the Habibie Center. Please see the program announcement for their full bios. Murray will speak first. He is a top Asia expert with 3 decades of experience living and working in Asia, and was Senior Associate of the Southeast Asia Program at CSIS Washington. He was Senior Director for Southeast Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and worked, many of us know him from that, worked for the Wall Street Journal in Beijing and Asia, and for the Far Eastern Economic Review in Washington and Southeast Asia. And I've mentioned his newest book, which is very pertinent to today's topic. Murray, go ahead, please.
Great. Thank you, David and Bill, for the kind invitation, and thank you for Dewi for participating in this event with me. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start by talking about China, Indonesia, partially because that's what I've been focusing on a lot lately, and partially because I think it's less understood, and particularly in Washington. And then I'll conclude with some comments on Indonesia-U.S. relations. One thing that's pretty clear is that President Jokowi has put more effort into boosting ties with China than many of his predecessors. He's developed close personal ties with Xi Jinping in the hope of getting funding for infrastructure projects. China has become Indonesia's most important trading partner. It's a major buyer of palm oil, and it's Indonesia's second largest investor after Singapore. It's fair to say that Beijing, like many foreign investors, is a little frustrated from time to time that projects take a long time to get off the ground. And I think Jokowi has probably been a little bit surprised at how much blowback he's getting domestically for boosting ties with China. I think everybody on this call probably knows that the China issue is quite sensitive in Indonesia, where ethnic violence has erupted twice since independence in the late 40s. And identity politics is often conflated in the Indonesia-China relations with the role of Chinese and Indonesians in the economy. We had the giant protests in 2016 opposing former Jakarta Governor Ahok, who was both a Christian and an ethnic Chinese, in his election bid on charges of blasphemy in 2016. And in the end, he didn't make it for a second term. Every year, the ISIS, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, does a poll. And it's interesting. I won't go into too many details here, but Indonesians, the elite Indonesians, which include officials, business people, journalists, NGO leaders, academics, in the poll that came out in January, said that 77% said that China is the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia. Only 7% said that about the US. Even more surprising is that 52% said that China was the most influential political and strategic power in the region. Only 27%, half as many, said that about the US. And if ASEAN had to choose between China and the US, Indonesians that answered the poll, 52% picked China, only 48% picked the US. That is really a flip. The last numbers are a flip for ASEAN overall. Overall, most Southeast Asians thought the region should pick the US slightly more than those that picked China. David already mentioned the Chinese consortium building the 90-mile, $5 billion high-speed rail from Jakarta to Bandung, which despite all the hype and kicking it off, has been delayed repeatedly because of various reasons, but one of the biggest ones is the difficulty in acquiring land. As I already mentioned, China has emerged as the second largest investor in Indonesia. It's really hard to tell how much China has invested in its Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia, but the RWR associates in Washington put together some figures for me that estimates that the BRI investments in Indonesia that have been launched between 2013 and 2018 total 84 billion, which is the 40% of the total in Southeast Asia. And I would argue, having visited all the countries in the 2 years before my book came out, that this number seems really high for Indonesia and for the region. In Indonesia, President Jokowi has put Indonesian state-owned enterprises in charge of most projects with China. That's to avoid taking on any sovereign Indonesian debt. But this also has prompted considerable concerns about the influx of ethnic Chinese that have come to help work on the projects. And you may have seen that in the middle of this year, there were quite a few protests for weeks on end in Sulawesi, charging that there were too many ethnic Chinese coming in to work in the various mining projects. Indonesia has handled this differently, China differently in many ways, besides the use of SOEs. One of them is that in 2018, Indonesia offered China a menu of $60 billion of projects. but most of these projects were in China would have preferred to work in Jakarta or Java, no doubt, but most of these projects are in remote provinces. David referred to some of these, but one area is North Kalimantan, where they're putting in some hydropower dams. North Sumatra, where they are doing special economic zones, particularly focused on palm and rubber. And in North Sulawesi, where I already mentioned, they're doing mining and mineral processing. China is also a very big investor in the digital space. China is focused mostly on Indonesia and on Singapore in the digital space, and Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com are investing literally billions. And they're attracted partially to Indonesia by, as everybody is, by the giant population, right? Almost 50% of ASEAN. So their projects are in e-commerce, online travel, fintech, and Chinese firms have invested in the 4 major Indonesian unicorns. These are companies worth over $1 billion, like Gojek, Tokopedia, etc. Huawei which is a controversial company here in the US, where the US is urging countries not to use Huawei technology for developing 5G. Indonesia, partially because of concerns that China will get access to what's communicated over the 5G network. But Indonesia is going ahead with China. And its outgoing communications minister said at the end of last year that Indonesia shouldn't be paranoid. Chinese tourists have also been an increasingly big deal to the Indonesian economy. There were 2.1 million in 2018. Obviously, tourism in the region has taken a big hit this year due to COVID. In the 2019 election campaign, Jokowi's critics, including his now defense minister Prabowo, raised quite a few questions about why he was so close to China, and suggested that if they were elected, that they would look at reevaluate some of these projects and whether they should be continued. The Indonesia, like all countries in Southeast Asia, has a fair number of ethnic Chinese, about 3 million, 2% of the population. They play an outsized role in the economy generally, but they have virtually no role in any of the projects from China. As I mentioned, Jokowi focuses on SOEs, which are obviously not run by the ethnic Chinese. And then David also referred to what's going on in the South China Sea. Indonesia, unlike Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, is not a claimant, yet China's 9-dash line passes through the Indonesia's exclusive economic zone in the northern reaches of Natuna. And of course, we don't know how wide those 9 dashes are, so we don't know how far into the Natunas they actually reach. But most of you will know that Natuna area is very rich in hydrocarbons and fish, but China does call this region a, quote, traditional Chinese fishing ground. And that has prompted considerable conflict between the two sides in recent years. Last December and January, Chinese Coast Guard vessels accompanied Chinese fishing boats into the region around Natuna. They're about 60 miles into Indonesia's EEZ. And so Jakarta, as David alluded to, sent in some warships and F-16s. And when Indonesia tried to arrest some Chinese fishermen, the Coast Guard intervened. The Coast Guard again showed up in September, just 2 months ago. I think most analysts suspect that China is trying to stake out the limits of the 9-dash line to see exactly how far it goes into the Natuna EEZ. Similar incidents happened in 2016, and there's been a lot of these incidents. Most of them are not reported, like happens in the case of Vietnam, where Vietnam will regularly report what China is up to. I'll just make a few other comments before switching to the US. The military ties began between China and Indonesia in 2005 when they established a strategic partnership and promised to deepen military ties. Indonesia in 2018 bought some sensors and weapon systems for naval vessels from China, but overall China sells far less military hardware to Indonesia than it does to neighbors like Thailand and Malaysia. They have frequent military dialogues, but I interviewed some people that are involved in these and say that dialogue is very pro forma, not very in depth. And it's kind of clear that economic ties in Indonesia are far more important than military ties. The last thing I'll talk about is soft power. China is getting more and more active in pushing various forms of soft power, from scholarships to exchanges to training sessions, etc. And I couldn't get recent figures on education, but in 2016, there were 68,000 Southeast Asians studying in China, 23,000 Thais, the biggest number, 15,000 from Indonesia, the second biggest number. China has also set up Confucius Institutes throughout the region. It's also involved in inviting to train in the Mandarin language. It is also quite active inviting academics, journalists, religious leaders to visit China. It's really been quite active in courting the big Muslim organizations like NU to visit Xinjiang. And in recent years, a number of prominent imams have gone, and they come back and very often describe the situation as quite benign. It's a bit like a summer camp. There's flowers, they eat halal, they pray 5 times a day, etc. That's a little different, I think, than the feeling on the street. Sometimes you have protests in front of the Chinese embassy protesting the treatment of the Uyghurs. One of the more interesting things I came across is that at least 2 of the political parties, including PDIP of Jokowi's party and the Democrat Party, which is SBY's party, they send regularly, I think annually, party officials to train in the communist training schools in China. They focus on how to build a party, how to manage party, the central state locality relations, how to recruit new members, and that kind of thing, which is kind of interesting. They do this also with Malaysia, where they invite ruling UMNO people and the ethnic Chinese party also. And then the last thing I'll say is that China has been very active in the wake of COVID. It has, since the middle of, I think in August, they signed an agreement to provide Indonesia with vaccines to deal with COVID. I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the US. David already summarized most of the points I was going to make, but one thing you have to say about US-Indonesia ties is they often don't live up to their potential. When the Trump administration was elected, Pence visited very early on. General Mattis visited repeatedly in his 2 years or so in office. And until this year, the Trump administration's engagement, I would describe at best episodic. Economic ties compared to China are very minimal. Two-way trade is for the world's second and fourth largest countries is only $30 billion, which is peanuts. I think part of the problem, I think, early on for the Trump administration, attitudes toward the Trump administration was some of Trump's statements about Muslims and his ban on Muslim immigrants, his plans to move the US embassy to Jerusalem, etc. And Indonesia just found far more access to Belt and Road infrastructure projects from China than it found from the US. Military ties have, I think, still kept cranking along under Mattis, Secretary Mattis, and some of his successors. There's quite a few engagements, well over somewhere between 150 and 200 engagements each year. And Indonesia in recent years has purchased Apache helicopters and refurbished F-16s from the US. But it was really only in this year, in 2020, that that the U.S. ramped up engagement. Jokowi, however, has met, by best calculations, because they're not always announced, but it seems that Jokowi has met Xi Jinping at least 8 times since 2014. But he's only met Trump once at the G20 summit in Germany. But Jokowi was planning to come to the Trump organized summit for ASEAN in Vegas in March. And I think David and Bob and others that were at the USINDO dinner remember General Lahut, the coordinating minister for maritime affairs and investment, was very enthusiastically talking about Trump also having invited, or Trump's aides were arranging for Jokowi also to visit Washington, which would have been unusual because they said no ASEAN leader was going to visit Washington at that time. But it was canceled in the end due to COVID. But the General Lahut has, coordinating minister Lahut has visited, met several times with Adam Buehler, who is the head of the DFC, the newly renamed DFC, the Development Finance Corp, the old OPEC, to discuss his plans, Lahut's plans for launching the $5.2 billion sovereign wealth fund. Buehler went to Jakarta in January and met with Jokowi and proposed some projects. And then he went back in October and made a pledge for $750 million of potential investment, communication technology, healthcare, infrastructure, et cetera. And I know that General Lahut had been planning a visit soon after the elections, but I understand maybe it's postponed because the elections are sort of a little bit in limbo here. It was also interesting that the US trade representative recently extended GSP privileges for Indonesia when it cut them for other countries, including Thailand. I think that is more a political statement, which Indonesia should interpret positively. And then David alluded to the visit by Defense Minister Prabowo, who'd been banned from visiting the US for the last 2 decades on human rights grounds. He was allowed to come and visit. And I think this was part of the US effort to start competing with China and part of its effort to respond to China in the South China Sea, which Secretary of State Pompeo has stressed a lot since July, and he visited Jakarta also to talk about this. But you know, I think the U.S. lags China in contributing to Jokowi's domestic agenda also, which makes it really tough to compete with China in areas like public health, economic challenges, infrastructure, et cetera. We don't know a lot about Biden's policy yet. You know, he was the vice president during Obama's rebalance to Asia. In Indonesia, U.S. ties were very close during this period. I think we should assume that Biden will continue U.S. economic, political, and security cooperation with Southeast Asia. He is much less likely than Biden to focus. Biden is less likely than Trump to focus on things like U.S. trade deficits. He'll likely continue low-level military engagement and cooperation. He is talked in the platform and during the campaign about engaging the world more multilaterally and using forums like ASEAN. The platform actually mentions ASEAN, which is a stunner. This should mean that Biden will appoint ambassador to ASEAN located in Jakarta, which Trump never did, and that he will also attend more summits. Trump only attended the 2017 East Asia Summit in Manila. And then the platform also talks about organizing a conference of democracies very early in the administration, and that's something likely where Indonesia will be able to feature prominently as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ibu Dewi.
Just an introduction of
Sorry.
Joey. Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar is in several worlds: academia, political activism, and government. She's research professor at the Center for Political Studies at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, LIPI, vice chair of the Board of Management at Habibie Center, Jakarta. She was in government as deputy secretary to the vice president of Indonesia for political affairs and for government policy support. She was assistant minister of the State Secretariat for Foreign Affairs during the Habibie presidency. She is and has been a member of several national and international advisory boards, which I won't name one by one, but believe me, there's many. She was an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow at the U.S. Congress, which is important to all of us. She's written widely on Indonesia's democratization, foreign policy, as well as on ASEAN regional political and security issues. And she's the perfect Indonesian, in our view, to cover the Indonesian part of this discussion. Ibu Dewi, please.
Thank you very much, Pak David and Pak Bill. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be invited to this joint USINDO-Stimson Center's discussions about Indonesia's foreign policy and how it navigates relations between these two superpowers, the United States and China. And I have to thank Pak Hiebert for making that very rich presentations, all of the details that it's clearly your background as a journalist, all the details, dates and facts and figures are at your fingertips, explaining Indonesia's increasingly close relations with China, particularly in the economic field, as well as the status of relations with the United States. So that's really, I don't have to do that anymore. And clearly, because I'm more into the big picture rather than to the details. I think we can complement each other. So I'm going to focus not just on Indonesian as a country, but also Indonesia as a country which is regarded as the first amongst equals, or naturally within ASEAN, and how the foreign policy of Indonesia at the bilateral level with the United States and China, as well as Indonesia within ASEAN, try to deal with this very difficult situation, particularly in the time of the great power rivalry, which has been intensified in the past years. So David has already mentioned about the doctrine of Indonesia's foreign policy, is a free and active foreign policy, or independent and active foreign policy. And of course, Indonesia conducts its foreign policy also using the non-aligned strategy. So although the Cold War has been over for a long time, this non-aligned status is considered to be a basic DNA for Indonesia's foreign policy strategy, put it that way. And within the region, Indonesia has continued to strive to ensure, that its main focus has always been, this concentric circles, ensuring the safety, peace, and stability within its nearest circle, which is Southeast Asia, and then outer circles, developing relations with other countries, which will ensure benefits to Indonesia's political, economic, and security needs. So within the priority of Indonesia's foreign policy is always the Southeast Asian region. And the focus has always been how to ensure peace, stability. And for that, the primary focus is to ensure ASEAN cohesiveness, ASEAN unity, and also to ensure the strategic autonomy of Southeast Asia, so that Southeast Asia is not dominated by an external power, and that it can act independently to its own best interest. And that also to ensure ASEAN centrality, that ASEAN will play an important role in managing relations with great powers. So I'll be talking both about Indonesia and ASEAN here. So the focus is again, Indonesia's role as the first among equal in ASEAN, and how Indonesia tries to inform ASEAN's policy in its relations with both China and the United States. Now, in terms of whether it is Indonesia as Indonesia or Indonesia as the largest member of ASEAN, relations with the United States and China are equally important. For Indonesia, the United States and China are both comprehensive strategic partners. Indonesia signed that first with China, and then under President Obama, with China, it was signed in 2005 with the United States. The comprehensive strategic partnership was only signed, I think it was just prior to the US entries to the East Asia Summit. So it was around 2010 or 2011 under President Obama. For President Joko Widodo, his foreign policy priority has been, for his first term and second term, has been economic diplomacy. In fact, he has instructed his diplomats to say, some 80% of their work should be focused on economic diplomacy to attract investment, to attract tourism, and to promote Indonesian exports. So it's a trade, tourism, and investment is really the primary focus of Indonesia's foreign policy under Joko Widodo. And Pak Marie has already mentioned about the fact that China is Indonesia's largest market now. Once upon a time, it was the US. But now the US is the second largest market. And of course, China has become the second largest source of foreign investment. And if you add Hong Kong to that, it's even higher. While the US is not even in the top 5 anymore. So for particularly, not just for the political security perspectives, from the perspective of economic needs, Indonesia wishes to have good relations with both the United States and China, benefiting from what each country can offer. And this has been outlined in quite great detail by Pak Marie. Particularly from China is this Jokowi's signature infrastructure development. It's not that easy to find investment for infrastructure. Indonesia has tended to favor China, but also trying at the same time, trying to attract Japanese investment. And now hopefully with this new policy and the Build Act from the United States, hopefully the United States can also be a player in this investment for infrastructure. But there is a great concern in Indonesia and particularly also in ASEAN that while great power competition can offer opportunities because there will be competition to offer incentives to countries, whether it's economic incentives or non-economic incentives. An escalation of tension between the great powers can pose a real danger, and Southeast Asia has been there before. After all, Southeast Asia was the theater of the Cold War, which is not cold in Southeast Asia, it's very hot, the Vietnam War, and also divisions, conflicts, intrastate conflicts within countries, because they can be divided, they can be torn apart by this external power competition. So there is a real concern for Indonesia in particular about maintaining ASEAN unity. And this has only been under strain because we know that within ASEAN, some ASEAN countries like Cambodia and Laos are much more dependent on China, and they have led to some problems within ASEAN. For example, in 2012, when when Cambodia was the chair of ASEAN, ASEAN for the first time failed to issue a joint communique because of a disagreement on language in the South China Sea, because Cambodia was under pressure from China, and just Indonesia at the time, Foreign Minister Martina Tegawa did a shuttle diplomacy to try to bring consensus again on this. So there is a genuine concern from Indonesia because of this desire to have a peaceful, a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality within the region, within Southeast Asia, that Southeast Asia does not become a new theater for a proxy war between the United States and China. So Indonesia has been very much the main driver in pushing for development of regional architecture, which is more open, transparent, inclusive, which respects international law. And I think one can remember, we should remember that it was Indonesia that really pushed since the beginning, in fact, since the foundation of the East Asia Summit in 2005, that Indonesia pushed for the inclusion of other countries beyond the ASEAN +3, beyond the ASEAN plus China plus Japan and Korea. So in 2005, the United States was not yet willing to accede to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, which is a condition for joining the East Asia Summit. So in the beginning, only Australia, India, and New Zealand were able to join. But after the Obama administration agreed to sign on to the TAC, United States was able to join in. Although a number of countries within the region, it's not too supportive of that in the beginning, but Indonesia was very opposed to the development of regional architecture, which is only limited to Asians. So despite Indonesia's, Indonesia has always been quite strongly quite object, to the participations of external powers in regional affairs. But lately, that has changed. That it tries to engage, but it tries to prevent the development of regional architecture in which China could become, the regional hegemon. So it has been the primary supporter, for example, also, not just of the East Asia Summit that includes the United States, Russia, and that besides Australia, New Zealand, and India, but also this, Indonesia has also been the driver behind the drafting of this ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which also stresses the principles of openness and inclusivity, and underlines that it should avoid it should avoid a zero-sum game approach in the Indo-Pacific region. So it has always tried, it has tried to play a role as a middle power, trying to be a bridge builder, trying to push through the ASEAN centrality, providing regional forums through ASEAN regional mechanisms to bring the different sides together so that they can develop a habit of dialogue. So this has been the main theme of ASEAN foreign policy in managing relations with great powers, i.e. through the agency of ASEAN. And now on recent issues, coming to focusing more, Pak David and Pak Marie has also mentioned about the relations between the United States and Indonesia, which recently has picked up. It has the Trump administrations will leave office on a higher note in terms of relations with Indonesia, with recent historic visit by Minister of Defense Prabowo to the US and met his counterpart there, and that has been mentioned about discussions about enhancing defense and security cooperation. And also Indonesia is very happy that there's this promise that the GSP facilities will be extended. There have been a lot of nervousness that, if the GSP facilities is not extended, then Indonesian exports to the US will become very uncompetitive, even more uncompetitive because of higher tariffs. Now, it's already been mentioned, so I'll only briefly touch on Indonesia-China relations because it's been detailed by Pak Marie that probably now is, under Jokowi, the relations with China has become really, really warm. I wrote last year about, Indonesia-China relations coming full circle. So this is very close in the 1950s until the mid 1960s, and then there's, and then we froze relations for quite a long time, for nearly 30 years. Now it's also very, very close relations again, particularly for economic reason. And Indonesia, has been mentioned, is very welcoming to the BRI initiative, to the Belt and Road initiatives. It has allocated certain sectors for BRI projects, like in in Kalimantan, in Sumatra, in Java, and also, this the much talked about building of the speed rail between Jakarta and Bandung. Although Indonesia is now also awarding Japan to include Japan in a mini, not the highest speed, but medium speed between Jakarta and Surabaya. So Indonesia is also a member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and relations have also become very close because over COVID, China, Indonesia, and China is developing the Sinovac COVID. But as has been mentioned, distrust towards China remains very, very high. There's, of course, there are various factors to this, historical factors, memories about the allegations of China's involvement in the abortive communist coup in 1965 remains very, very, very alive. In fact, the issues of communism is again, it's becoming a political issue. If you remember, during the 2019 presidential election, this is one of the accusations, for example, that's been batted out by the opposition. So this, the bogies of communism remains alive in Indonesia, and suspicions of China related to this remains high, and concerns about China's economic domination. Also, the questions of Chinese workers coming to Indonesia, because a lot of these Chinese projects are like build, operate, and transfer. So it's Chinese money, Chinese workers, and then not too much of multiplier effect. So there's also been concerns about influx of Chinese workers, although in most cases it's exaggerated. And of course, this is always also complicated with domestic politics, particularly the presence, still the contested role of Indonesian Chinese, particularly in the economic sector, and of course China's assertive role in the South China Sea. These incursions to the North Natuna Sea has already been outlined by Marie, and we read the same report that's been mentioned by Marie about the state of Southeast Asia in 2020, that was published by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, and I think that it is worth paying attention to that, because policies are often not based on realities, but also mostly driven by perceptions, and it is, and I would say that in general, you could say that neither United States nor China has very high level of credibility in Southeast Asia. Both countries are distrusted, and in Indonesia in particular, that's why Indonesia has this free and active foreign policy, not wanting to be aligned to any countries. This inherent suspicions of major powers. So maybe it has already been mentioned about which is the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia, and it says that China comes very high there, 79.2%, and US only 79.9%. But at the same time, most are worried about the Chinese growing economic influence in the region. In Indonesia, it says that 61.4% are worried about China's economic influence, slightly lower than the ASEAN total. The ASEAN total is 71.9% are worried. So Indonesia is 61.4, so above, below the ASEAN average. But maybe because the US economic influence is relatively low, although it's higher, it has gone, in 2019, US was only perceived as having influence by 3.5%. So it's gone up to 7.4% in 2020, but it's still lagging far behind China. But at the same time, the US economic influence is viewed more positively at 70.2% by the whole of ASEAN, but in Indonesia it's slightly lower at 63.6%. Now, this is the most important thing is also at the attitude towards political and strategic influence, comparing China and the US. 85.4% within ASEAN total are worried about China's political influence, while 52.7% have more positive attitudes towards the United States. But this is the outlier that's mentioned by Marie. In Indonesia, it's quite different, that 73.3% are worried about China and 70.8% are worried about the United States. So it means that Indonesia neither welcomes the Chinese influence nor welcomes the US influence. And probably this is not surprising. After all, Indonesia froze diplomatic relations with China for nearly 3 decades. And then it had a history of telling the US to go to hell with its aid. So Indonesia is quite fair about this, to both countries. It just shows, I think, it's Indonesia's basic nationalistic attitude. And it's very important also to notice that only 3.1% in ASEAN wants ASEAN or ASEAN countries to take side in the US-China rivalry. So the rest, they do not want to take side and want to strengthen ASEAN's resilience so that ASEAN, can ward off this external impact of the US-China impact on the region. Now, there is some, unfortunately, quite bad news for the US in the engagement in the region. When comparing the Trump administration to the Obama administration, for example, there is a real perception that US engagement in the region has decreased quite, by a large majority, 77% at the ASEAN level. But from Indonesian perspective, it says that 79.7% there's a decrease in US engagement in the region. And this has an impact on the the perceptions of the US as a reliable strategic partner. So within ASEAN, there's no or little confidence of the US. It's at 47%, and some confidence at 30.9%. So that means that, and the rest is no comment. So that the majority, though it's a plurality majority, has little confidence in the US as a reliable partner. In Indonesia, it's even higher. There's no or little confidence in the US at 59.5%. So US has some serious credibility problem within the region, because there is perception of lack of engagement. So lack of confidence or distrust towards China is due to China's policy, assertive policy, but distrust towards the US is less about what the US does, but rather because of US relative absence. But coming forward, there is interesting one that, is this perceptions of the US reversible? And it says yes. It says within ASEAN total, 60.3% believes that, in ASEAN believes that a change in administration in the United States could be seen to be more positive. The US is expected to have a much more reliable role as a strategic partner and provider of regional security in the region. And the percentage is even higher in Indonesia. At 64.8% believes that a change in administration could make the US much more engaged with Southeast Asia and makes it much more reliable. So that there is an expectation that a Biden administration was a vice president during, Biden was the vice president during Obama, and Obama, of course, with special connections with Indonesia and his rebalancing towards Asia and special policy that was seen to be giving more attention to the region, attended all the necessary regional meetings that was hosted by ASEAN. There is an expectation that maybe there'll be some return to that earlier attention. So it's viewed positively in that respect. Although if you read the media in Jakarta, there are also some of the maybe some of the leftover from the new order period, probably, or concerns. Indonesia as a democracy should not be concerned too much about its comments from outside about democracy and human rights. But there are concerns that there is recognition that a democratic administration tends to be much more influenced by values than the Republican administration. So traditionally, the new order government also had to always prefer a Republican who just wanted to trade and sell arms, while the Democrats used to make criticisms about human rights and good governance and so on. So there are some concerns about that, but at the same time there are others, and here I don't mind being quoted. In my case, there are serious democratic deficits within the region. There's been a real regression within ASEAN, and include also, in Indonesia, there have been many seminars and papers, including in Indonesia. There have been demonstrations in Indonesia, opposing laws which are considered to be problematic in terms of the democratic process. So some argue that a US administration also doesn't only focus on trade and security, but also pays attention to democracy and human rights and good governance and environment. Would be good. That we also need that because Indonesia also need to pay attention to that. But at the same time, I think Indonesia would like to see that some of the policies that has been carried out by Trump would continue to be followed up, so that it's not changed completely. For example, this recent agreements or discussions about strengthening defense and security cooperation, and also this extending the GSP facilities. Hopefully, the Biden administration will not revoke that. And there is a really genuine expectation. We like to see the Bill Act that was signed by President Trump, and this establishment of the U.S. International Defense Finance Corporation, supposedly a development bank from the U.S. to allow the U.S. to pay, to be able to participate in this infrastructure development, because usually because the U.S. investment is of course mostly driven by private sector. So this facilities is supposed to enable private sector also to engage in the infrastructure development. We would like to see more of that. Hopefully something will be realized. So there's a lot of hope. There are endless webinars, discussions in Indonesia. I just spoke about the possible policy of Biden in Southeast Asia, and I might state it that basically it's bipartisan, because Southeast Asia is not that important to the US. So there's less disagreement about Southeast Asia than other more maybe contested region in terms of the US policy. So I should stop there. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing, and a very trenchant and interesting remarks. Thank you, Ibu Dewi. We have about 30 minutes for Q&A, which is a perfect time. I'd like to invite Bill Wise, as mentioned earlier, to moderate the Q&A. I see the Q&A button already has several questions lined up. And Bill, I think you're accessing those, right? You have those, right?
That is correct. We are ready to go with
Go ahead.
the audience questions for the panelists. Let's begin with a question about the Biden administration's environmental policies. The questioner suggests that the Biden administration will be more active in promoting plans to cut carbon emissions and dependence on fossil fuels. The questioner asks, though, how the panelists see U.S. climate change policy as likely to affect Indonesia's economy, especially the extractive industries. Perhaps we could start with Murray. And Murray, you need
Right. I couldn't find my cursor. Sorry. I mean, so I think the first thing we have to say is we don't know yet. That's really getting a little bit in the weeds. We don't know yet how far the Green New Deal is going to go. It may face some challenges in Congress, particularly if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate. I don't think we know yet what exactly the Biden policies are going to be toward countries, other countries, on their environmental policies. Whether that affects what happens with forests and palm oil and that kind of stuff. I would say I have no idea. I think there will be probably more emphasis on trying to encourage the use of renewables and maybe of gas rather than coal, that's for sure. And that, of course, could mean that Indonesia would have more trouble exporting some of its coal, I would imagine, but really to other countries. But I really don't think we can go into a lot of detail here yet. I think it's something that we should watch, but it's not something that's really a pretty granular issue for an administration that hasn't even formally set up its transition yet.
Another questioner asks about the upcoming ASEAN summit, perhaps, and how Indonesia will be approaching this summit, as well as perhaps the approach that some of the outside partners may have. Ibu Dewi, do you have some thoughts on the upcoming ASEAN summit?
Yeah, of course, the COVID-19 would be the focus, of one of the discussions, because now even the summit is done via Zoom. So so that the focus will be on how to live in new normal. I think there's talk about beginning to have a travel corridor within ASEAN. And everybody's putting a lot of faith in this vaccine development. So so the issues of the public health impact of COVID, the social welfare impact of COVID, and then the economic recession impact of COVID, and how to revive the economy will be the focus. So they will. I think the ASEAN leaders and as well as the dialogue partners will try to make separate deals, bilateral deals. For example, Indonesia and Japan has already talked about maybe developing some travel bubble for business travelers, for example. So I imagine that would be one of the issues of how to survive in this COVID-19 and maybe overcome the challenges.
Murray, do you have a thought on that?
Oh, I totally agree with Ibu Dewi about the COVID being the focus. The economic recovery is affecting absolutely the need to recover their economies is needed in all the countries. I think perhaps because it's being hosted by Vietnam, there could be some discussion on the South China Sea, but exactly what that will be, I know some of these issues that that will be discussed within ASEAN have been, the post ASEAN meeting statements have been quite debated this week, and I think it's not entirely clear what'll end up being decided at this point. Over to you, Bill.
Well, thank you, Murray. We also have a question on the Quad, the relationship with powers outside of ASEAN in Southeast Asia. And the question is, will Indonesia, or how will Indonesia deal with the Quad? Is it a threat to ASEAN's centrality? Is it a problem for Indonesia to align itself too closely with the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, too closely with the Quad and perhaps jeopardize its relationship with China on initiatives like the BRI. Marie, or either of you actually, let's start with Marie.
Well, actually, Bill, could I suggest that Ibu Dewi start? Because Indonesia has some strong views on the Quad, and I think it'd be useful to have them maybe start, or have her start, sorry.
Perfect. Ibu Dewi, can you start?
Well, officially, Indonesia doesn't have a view on the Quad. You know, it's a sovereign rights of 4 countries to form cooperation. And don't forget, the Quad met the first time and subsequent times in ASEAN regional meetings. You know, in the so within if our dialogue partners decide to meet and enhance cooperation among themselves, you know, it is no problem. You know, for ASEAN or for Indonesia, it becomes a problem if it is seen to be becoming a military alliance.
Ask a question. I raised my hand and I've put stuff in the chat.
You know, it becomes a problem if it is seen to be a real containment policy. So really, feelings within ASEAN is divided. Within Indonesia, too.
Okay.
You know, it has its purpose. Most say it's not going to impact too much. It serves a purpose, seen as, you know, possible deterrent to China. But Indonesia will not likely to be joining it because then it won't be a Quad. But as you know, 1.5 tracks or track 2, Indonesia has participated in some Quad meetings. So if Indonesia is invited, for example, to join exercises, Indonesia has military exercises with all of the Quad member countries. You know, so I'm sure that there'll be discussions about it because Indonesia has exercises with the US, it has exercises with Australia, with India, with Japan. Now, if it were to join exercise, I don't know. I do not want to preempt Indonesia's defense policy or diplomatic policy here, but it will be cautious about not being seen or being part of a containment of China policy. At the same time, Indonesia is not averse to having exercises with any of the Quad members.
Thank you.
Bill.
Yes, Murray, please.
Yeah, I just want to say briefly, I mean, I think that how Ibu Dewi described the Indonesian reaction, that's pretty much the reaction throughout ASEAN. All the other countries largely agree that they don't want to be involved. And there was even some concern, as we know, about the Indo-Pacific, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, where Indonesia wrote a paper for ASEAN, and then Thailand wrote another paper suggesting, you know, that ASEAN was quite happy with the increased role of the US in the region, but it did not want to join any front that was going to be confronting China. Now, that said, we have no idea what Biden's people think about the Quad. We have no idea. They don't use the words free and open Indo-Pacific that I've heard. So they'll likely pick some of their own words, like the Trump guys got rid of the rebounds to Asia. But I think the one thing that is certain, they have talked a lot about needing, the Biden people have talked a lot about needing to have a coalition of countries that deal with China, criticize China in the South China Sea, that deal with China on economic issues, rather than going bilaterally, as many people perceived the Trump administration doing, especially on the economic side.
Thank you, Murray. We'll have a question from Bob Blake, and I think Bob would like to ask it live. But a reminder to everyone else, please use the Q&A function on your screen to pose questions in writing. Bob Blake.
Sorry, I couldn't figure, I'm not adroit enough to figure out how to use the Q&A. I was put it in the chat. Anyway, I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks to both the panelists for really a terrific presentations on both of their parts. I had two brief comments and one question. My comment first was about the strategic partnership, because I think there's some misunderstanding about that. When President Jokowi went to visit Obama in 2014, when I was ambassador, it was the Indonesians, interestingly, who were pushing for moving from a comprehensive partnership to a strategic partnership, which was good. And the difference is that in a strategic partnership, you have a real strategic dialogue, usually between the foreign ministers, to sort of think about, how do we work more closely together and deal with some of our common problems. And I really regret that under the Trump administration, nothing really ever came of it. There was, to my knowledge, never really a serious strategic dialogue. But it's my sincere hope that under the next administration that we will see that, because there's plenty to talk about, not just sort of COVID diplomacy, but in the Indo-Pacific, about China, about terrorism, about a whole range of things, and not to mention democracy, as Murray was talking about. So that's one thing. On GSP, it wasn't a political decision. It was the reason that it was extended was that the Indonesian government did a terrific job of responding to all of the concerns that have been raised by USTR and by US companies. And so I really give credit to our new ambassador, Pak Lutfi, but also to Mahendra Siregar, who really worked their way through the long list of issues and dealt with them. By contrast, Thailand really never dealt with the one issue on the agenda, which was pork. And so in frustration, USTR finally cut them off. So my question is about BRI. Yes, it's very good that they're involved in promoting infrastructure. My concern is the lack of transparency with BRI projects. And oftentimes they're state-owned enterprise to state-owned enterprise transactions. That has increased the weight of the SOE sector, which is now the largest in Asia other than China. But it is also, in my view, enhanced corruption and diminished transparency. There's very little information about what are the terms of these various deals and so forth. I wonder if each of the panelists could comment on that.
Dewi, would you like to start?
Well, I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert on this, but but Bob is right that the role of the SOEs, but during the Jokowi administrations, and maybe also because it's a reflection of the policy of the Partai Demokrasi Indonesia, there is a strong push towards enlarging the role of the SOEs. Because in Indonesia, this under our constitution is the state has to be the primary provider of all the goods for the people. So there is basic suspicions of capitalism and free enterprise. While on the one hand we talk about promoting small and medium scale and micro enterprises, when it comes to providing the basic goods like infrastructure, water, energy, and so on, the Indonesian people do not want to give them to private sectors. You remember that the kerfuffle of providing water in Jakarta, when it was provided by a private company, there was class action against it, and yet it was repealed. It was revoked. So there is a general acceptance within the Indonesian public. It's not seen as corruption is, of course, a problem, and several directors of SOEs have been jailed, but so have a lot of private sector's directors who are bribed, officials. So corruption is not just the monopoly of public sectors, but as I said, in Indonesia, when it comes to sectors which are considered to be dealing really with the basic needs of the people, the preference is to do SOEs. You look at this, providing COVID it's with biopharma, which is also another SOE. It will not, if it were to be given to a private pharmaceutical company, there will be a general uproar because it will be seen, you know, as benefiting just a particular group. While if it is SOEs, it's considered to be, you know, it belongs to the whole state, to the whole nations. And after all, you know, the directors are supposed to be appointed in a more independent manner as well. I think that's my response to that.
Murray.
Yes, I'll respond briefly. So I guess the big concern, of course, though, and I agree with what Ibu said, but in many ways for Indonesia, but the concern is that rating agencies are saying that the SOEs in Indonesia are way overextended. And this does have some potential economic impact, could have potential economic impact going forward. If a couple of these guys just take on way too much debt, these projects, none of which are going to be money making in the BRI, basically, like the high-speed rail or the hydropower dams. And so they're going to have a real trouble repaying their loans going forward. And so I think that is a big danger for Indonesian SOEs. And the rating agencies over the past year or year and a half have raised that a number of times. On Bob's larger question, yes, it is not transparent at all. It was almost impossible for me to get, for example, interest rate, get the figure of interest rates that are being charged, and they're really very different in each country. Everybody is negotiating separately because the goal of the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank is to make money. And so they try to charge as high a rate as possible, and often it's over 4%. Japan, JBIC is under 1%. Just for comparison, there is a lot of corruption. The one that got exposed most maybe is in Malaysia, the East Coast Rail Link, that Najib negotiated basically with Chinese officials by himself. He had no experts in the room with him, according to Mahathir and some of his advisors later. Could be slightly exaggerated, but it was not negotiated by finance ministry experts, for example. And he agreed to pay a high interest rate. He agreed to overpay because he hoped that the companies that were involved would end up buying help him recover some of the debt that was owed by the One Malaysia Development Berhad, 1MDB. And so Mahathir canceled the project based on what they could tell, and they went back to China and renegotiated that deal. I find it unconscionable that China would let its state-owned banks and officials from SOEs negotiate very corrupt deals with another country. And, and everybody we're just going to change the terms and we're going to continue going ahead. That was no way to solve that problem in Malaysia. And we have just seen the first company bite the dust in Southeast Asia from BRI projects, and that's the EDL Electricity Distribution Company in Laos, which in mid-September had to turn itself over basically to China Power Grid, a company, because it was not able to pay for its debts that it took on for various of its infrastructure projects, including for some that are involved in building dams. And so we could see some of this stuff happen, which I really think if China, which Xi Jinping promised late last year at his let's renew the BRI, and let's be transparent and deal with corruption. Let's deal with labor issues. Let's deal with environmental issues. China really has a ways to go before it's going to get a clean bill of health, I think, from its projects in the region. Sorry, it's a bit of a windy answer, but I have some views on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Murray. And staying on the subject of trade and investment, there is a question specifically for Murray. How much of the flow of Singapore investment into Indonesia is really U.S. companies investing through Singapore? In other words, is the U.S. investment in Indonesia really greater than the statistics would suggest?
Um, you know, if we knew the answer to that exactly, then we could answer it better. But there's a large assumption that that's the case. And Bob, having been ambassador there, may well know more about the details. It's assumed, but it's not known how much U.S. companies do through Indonesia, which is actually common in many of the countries around the region where U.S. and other companies will go through Singapore.
AmCham did a study in 2014 that actually studied this and concluded that at that time, at least, the United States, if you factored in the investments from Singapore from U.S. companies, the U.S. was the largest investor in Indonesia. I don't know whether that would still be true because, of course, there's been massive investment by China since then. But at least at the time, that was the calculation.
That was 2014?
Yeah.
On the tangentially related, we have several questions on the U.S. policy toward China and the U.S.-China so-called trade war, whether the Biden administration is likely to make a positive step to try to end at least the warfare aspect of U.S.-China trade relations. And related to that, there are a couple of questions on whether the United States should or will consider under a Biden administration joining TPP and or RCEP. Murray, we'll start with you and then go to Ibu Dewi from there.
I think, we've heard Biden's rhetoric during the campaign. We've seen the Democratic Party platform. I think I think that that's one area. China's trade surplus, some of its behavior, its stealing of intellectual property rights, forced technology transfer, its subsidies to state-owned enterprises, those kinds of things. That's a pretty bipartisan view in the U.S. at this point. Both parties, I think, would largely agree with that. A couple of things where Biden may be a little different is in the way he talks about it, and by what he said he'd like to involve other countries, because the U.S. would be much more, the U.S. message would be much stronger if it involved Japan, Germany, the UK, Australia, etc., in challenging China on some of its trade policies, and maybe have some ability to pressure China, because China does eventually respond to pressure like most countries. But I don't see that policy is going to change anytime soon. On the TPP and the RCEP, I think we learned already in the 2016 election campaign that when Secretary Clinton was put under a lot of pressure on the TPP, I think there's at that point, the Republicans maybe would have voted for ratification of the TPP, but they've also changed under President Trump their views on trade. So I think it would be quite difficult, although Vice President Biden has said that if the now so-called CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, if they were open to renegotiating some terms that, especially on labor and environmental issues, that the U.S. might be open to changing, might be open to joining. I don't know to what extent the countries would be open. They would welcome the U.S. joining, but they don't want to reopen those negotiations that went on for a full 5 years before the TPP was completed. And the RCEP, it's not clear that the U.S. actually could join the RCEP because it's intended for Asean and its 6 dialogue partners with which ASEAN already has bilateral trade agreements, and RCEP is intended to sort of rationalize some of the differences between these agreements. And the U.S. is way off, so is not nearly ready or eligible to join, so I'm not sure that's an issue yet.
Dewi, does Indonesia have specific expectations for the United States on the subject of U.S.-China trade or regional trade issues?
Well, as I mentioned, seeing the figures from the survey, Indonesia is most concerned about the adverse impact of the trade war because it's triple jeopardy for Indonesia. First, Indonesia's largest export markets is China, and mostly it exports primary commodities, raw materials or semi-finished products. So when China's demands for that sort of exports have declined, Indonesia's trade with China also declined significantly. At the same time, the expectations that Indonesia would be able to replace some of those Chinese exports to US market has not really borne fruits either, because Indonesia is not as competitive as, say, Vietnam. And then thirdly, which made President Joko Widodo very, very upset, was that the expectations that the relocation of some of these industries from China to Southeast Asia, whether it's Chinese companies or American companies or Japanese, Korean companies, have not gone to Indonesia either. It's much more complicated field in Indonesia. So they mostly also gone to other countries, particularly Vietnam. So this triple problems for Indonesia, with this onset of trade war, there's no win for Indonesia there. So it would be, hopeful. It will want to see some easing of that, so that Indonesia can again start to export its products, which are, from the range of primary commodities to manufactured products.
We have time for one last question, and I'm combining a couple of questions here on human rights in Indonesia, and I'd like to pose it this way to Ibu Dewi first. What is the future of human rights as a topic of importance in U.S.-Indonesia relations? What can we learn from the Prabowo visit about emphases on human rights in both countries, and also from Secretary of State Pompeo's recent visit to Jakarta, where he invoked the problem of the Uyghurs in China as a issue that the two countries, the U.S. and Indonesia, should be concerned about?
Well, I think for Indonesia, happenings, human rights abuses in other countries are important. But I think for Indonesia and the United States, we also have to look internally. Both Indonesia and the United States have gross human rights problems. The police brutalities, which is being shown daily, and demonstrations in Indonesia, demonstrations in the US, minority rights in both countries. I think it behoves us, as big democracies with very pluralistic societies. I think, strengthening our respective democracies, strengthening our human rights protections would be the best way forward. So, rather than simply going out trying to preach human rights to countries, we are all living in glass houses. And I think that would have more traction. It has more credibility.
Murray, very briefly, your thoughts.
Bill, after what Ibu Dewi just said, all I can say is amen. I agree with it 100%. I can't begin to compete with saying it nearly as eloquently as she just did.
As the poser of questions, I was reluctant to jump in with a view, but in this case, I will agree with you, Murray. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to our USINDO partner for this very vibrant and fascinating discussion. Thanks to our speakers. You really did a terrific job for us today, and we are all in your debt. And also thank you to the audience for participating with us today. I regret we didn't have an opportunity to get to all of the questions, but I think the questions were excellent. They were provocative and on point, and we are grateful to you for being with us on this. From the perspective of the Southeast Asia Forum at Stimson Center, again, thanks to USINDO. Please visit our new website at the Southeast Asia Forum at Stimson Center, the Stimson Center website. We're still developing, we're new, but we're working very hard to focus attention on academic and operational use of research information on U.S. Southeast Asia relations and on the region itself. David, you have the last word.
Just to say thank you, Bill, for your role. Thanks to our two distinguished panelists for their excellent presentations and comments. Thanks to our audience and our partners for this fascinating program. And have a good evening and good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David and Bill and Ibu Dewi.
Thank you.